couple of months. Our final conversation for today is going to be focusing on migration and development on the African continent. It follows a forum held by the National Planning Commission and the International Organization for Migration under the theme Migration as a Development Catalyst. And of course, joining us for the conversation is the Deputy Chairperson of the National Planning Commission, Professor Dinyiko Maluleke. Prof, good morning to you. Thanks for your time this morning.
Good morning, Kathy. Long time.
Yes, it has been a while. Great to hear from you and be in conversation with you this morning, Prof. I wanted to ask you, I've looked at the statement that came out of conference and also some of the remarks that were made during this forum. It seems to me that it was intentionally provocative to have the theme of migration as a development catalyst. Why is it that it is provocative? Why did you feel that you were pushing against the grain?
Well, yes and no. I don't know that it is necessarily provocative or only provocative. I think that migration has been, for the longest time in human history, a catalyst for development. If we look at it in the long term, in the long haul, and not limit it to the now and the most contemporary experience of it. So there was nothing provocative intended. I think it was meant seriously. It does sound provocative because the issue of migration has become, in some ways, controversial and has been handled in divisive ways in many countries. It certainly has become an issue on which election campaigns turn, both in Europe, in the US, and in other parts of the world. And in that sense, a statement that ought to be quite mundane and ordinary comes across as provocative.
Do you feel that there is a prevailing narrative around migration and the fact that it's seen more as an inhibitor of development rather than as a catalyst for development?
Yeah, certainly the dominant narrative in some parts of the world, certainly in our part of the world, seems to be edging towards that, understanding of migration as an inhibitor of development. Because when you mention the word migration, people immediately think of illegal immigrants, they immediately think of undocumented immigrants, they immediately think of the struggle or the jostling for opportunities between immigrants and citizens of certain countries. So to that extent, yes, it has a bad name. Certainly in some parts of the world more than others, but it ought not to be an automatic case that migration is always and necessarily bad, because migration is the migration of talent, it is the renewal of countries, it is the exchange of ideas and skills. And it ought to be seen in a much broader context. And that is not to deny the problems that come with certain kinds of migration and the way different states manage migration.
So when we look at the opportunity then that migration presents, how do you think that individual countries should be approaching this conversation? Because again, one very much gets the sense that there are right ways and wrong ways of dealing with the question of migration.
Yeah, certainly. I think one of the important things, points made at our conference was the significance of data, that migration policies and migration practices ought to be informed by data, hard data and evidence, and that we need to move away from mythical statements and imaginary numbers and imagined patterns of migration, and rely as much as possible on hard data. But to generate hard data, you need functioning systems within nation states. Departments of Home Affairs should be more on top of the game than has been the case in many states. And the sharing of data between states ought to be at a higher level than it currently is. And my sense, our sense at the conference was that the data ought to be digitized more, so that it is possible to manage, the numbers and understand what exactly is going on better than now. So we live in a situation where there is a lot of imagination. I'm not sure which number is ringing, or is it ringing in my ears only?
No, yeah, we heard it on air too. The team is trying to deal with it. Apologies.
Okay. So, data is a very important aspect of it, and also just sharing of data between states, but also between state and private companies, because there are many private companies involved in migration, either as recruiting agencies or sometimes merely as transportation agencies. And then, of course, the laws around migration, the cost of migration, both for those who migrate from one country and the countries that receive them. That kind of information tends to be very much mythical, and people make it up instead of making sure that we know the numbers well. And we also looked at the other side of the economic impact of migration, both on receiving and sending countries, as an area of further exploration if we are to understand migration as a catalyst for development.
Does it not assume, Prof, that countries are moving from the same page on this conversation? Because in order to have the kind of collaboration and working together, data sharing that you envision, it would mean that all countries need to support migration and support the idea that migration is good for development. And yet we know that there are countries who are talking about reinforcing their borders, building walls. And what that speaks to is not necessarily around these countries only protecting their sovereignty, but there's an undertone to it that also suggests that there's some people that are not welcome here.
Oh, yes. I mean, I don't want to repeat some of the statements that have been said by some world leaders like Donald Trump around the issue of migration and the building of walls and countries that are described in terms that should not be repeated anywhere. So there is that kind of narrative going on, but I think that is the extreme, really. I think most countries appreciate that migration cannot be stopped, certainly not through the use of walls or profiling, because there's also widespread profiling of people depending on race, gender, and nationality, sometimes religion, around issues of migration. Those will not take us anywhere. And I think that the sooner countries understand that and share information about that, the better. Of course, in order to have a rational and controlled and understood flow of migration in and out. We need the necessary laws. We need the necessary data. We need the necessary collaboration. But we also need to appreciate the positive in migration instead of only emphasizing the negative. I mean, think about the talent that may accrue to a country that does not have that talent at that time through migration, which is properly managed and properly controlled. Think of the economic power of people in the diaspora and how much they contribute back to their own country, but also contribute to the country where they live as migrants. So all of these things, rather than treat migration as a stepchild, as a bad word, as a swear word, we ought to be looking for ways to explore its potential. Of course, I'm not speaking about lawlessness. I'm not speaking about a situation where we just, a laissez-faire kind of situation, but one where data, evidence, rationality, science, and digitalization basically drive our policies and protocols for migration.
Prof, some of the stats that were shared during the conference was around the African diaspora and how $65 billion is sent to the continent through the diaspora. And this figure, of course, surpasses what Africa receives in international aid. So those numbers, of course, are absolutely staggering because we just think about it as money that perhaps is sent from one member of a family to their relatives back home. Now, the cumulative effect becomes this 65 billion rand. What is the opportunity that is presented by that? How do you see the diaspora being part of this conversation?
One of the most exciting segments of the conference was precisely that. Just for us to come to terms with the amount of economic and capital injection that the continent receives from Africans in the diaspora, and how often this injection is left out of the mainstream economy and is not properly accounted for, and it is not even facilitated. In fact, in many countries, it is made hard for one to send money from one country to another, with all manner of admin fees and taxes and hurdles, and how the removal of all those could even add an extra 10 billion from the amount that you have just mentioned. So we need to find a way to streamline, but also to bring the diaspora remittances into the main economy and not just between families. And that would mean making sure that, listening to the plans that countries like Ethiopia have, and some of the ways in which they have used the remittance money for the national project and not just for the families. And the plans that countries like Nigeria have, if those plans were to be realized around diaspora remittances, then we could begin to see the impact of these injections of remittances into the GDP and not just the families. For now, it is left between families, and often it tends to be made very, very difficult for even family members to send money to one another, and they get taxed and punished heavily for doing it.
What is the case? What is the case that you think countries would be able to make to individuals? Because ultimately, these are individuals that have worked very hard for for lack of a better phrase, find themselves out of the system, create opportunities for themselves. And, it's not wrong for them to want their families to be the beneficiaries of that progress. So how would you justify that? To say, well, actually, instead of sending your remittances to your family, we think that there's a broader cause here. Help us build South Africa, help us build Malawi, help us build Nigeria.
Well, of course, already by sending money to their families, they are contributing to the economy of the country, because they are giving their families buying power. They are giving their families earning power that they might not have, and impacting mitigating, maybe that's a better word, mitigating the effects of poverty, unemployment, and inequality that we talk about. They are already mitigating those by just between the families. But if we were to encourage them to think about not just their families, but the national issues and the future of children, for example, and how they might contribute to the education system, to the building of schools and universities, I think many of them would be keen to participate. I mean, Ethiopia has proved that Ethiopians overseas are interested in whether the country has dams and water and so on, and they are willing to contribute to that. I think they just need to be encouraged. They just need to be given a plan, and they just need to be shown that their dollar can go a little further if they invested it wider than they do.
Prof, as we get ready to wrap up this conversation, one of the points that I think will be important for me to raise is around the case studies that you looked at the conference, and the question of the economies and how closely intertwined economies on the continent are. Because, again, often when we look at the question of migration, especially for a country like South Africa, we see ourselves almost as somewhat of a pariah state, right? That we're operating almost independently, and yet we know that our economic fortunes are tied to not only the Southern African region, but also to the broader continent. That's the only way we're going to be able to grow our economies. How do we begin to have that conversation in a way that perhaps fosters greater understanding around migration, and also the preparedness that individual countries need to have?
Yeah, the nation state is both a blessing and a curse. And it is not about South Africa. It is about all countries. I mean, the advent of the nation state gave every nation state the impression that it could exist on its own, and that it does not need, all it needs to do is to concentrate on sealing its borders and so on. But actually, the conversation you are asking me about, Katie, we have already been having on the continent when we began to speak about trade. I mean, many years ago when Kwame Nkrumah spoke about the United States of Africa. But more recently, around trade and the transportation or travel of goods between African borders. But what we need to do is to fine-tune the idea of the traveling of people between African borders, so that people don't need to jump through fences and to look for ways to beat the system. And in that way, we would be able to know who's where and what contribution can they make, what potential do they have. So we are already having those conversations. There is no way that the South African economy will, in the long term, be able to survive if all our borders are sealed. We depend on Zambia just as much as Zambia depends on us. We depend on Malawi just as much as Malawi depends on us. There are thousands, if not millions, of South Africans all over the continent, and South African companies actually all over the continent. So we are much more interdependent than we let on. And if we were to be rational and to open up protocols and policies and to make sure that we acknowledge these interdependencies and leverage them rather than demonize them, I think that we could go further.
All right. Prof, thank you for your contributions to this conversation. Professor Diniko Maluleke is the Deputy Chairperson of the National Planning Commission. It's 11:30, time for the latest news headlines.
The Talking Point with Kathy Motlatlana. Weekdays, 9 a.m. till midday.
Well, this conversation has been brought to you by Absa Business Banking. Your story matters. Absa. Well, Absa has spent the past year introducing new programs to support women who want to become entrepreneurs. Our next guest is going to be sharing some of the reasons for the underrepresentation of women in business and what Absa believes can be done to empower these women entrepreneurs. Joining us is Kanya Matsikwe, Head of Client at Absa. Kanya, good morning to you. Thank you for your time this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Look, we know that the entrepreneurship landscape has absolutely changed, especially on a formal basis. We are seeing the entry of more and more women. Unfortunately, however, it is still lower than that of men. And sometimes it comes down to the challenges that women face. Do you get the sense that it's just generally tougher for women to be in business than men? And why?
Thank you for that question. And it's interesting coming out of Women's Month that we're just celebrating last month. You know, while in South Africa, we're known as having an entrepreneurial spirit, and there's no doubt that there's a lot of opportunity that exists. The reality is that most business owners, regardless of whether they're men or women, do face many challenges. But there are some challenges that are unique to women, such as, you know, juggling the responsibilities of a home. We know from Stats SA data that 42% of households in South Africa are run and led by women. But other challenges include, you know, poor access to networks, you know, having a voice in the room to be able to get access to funding and representation on investment teams in particular are some of the challenges that women in business face that their male counterparts don't to the same degree.
When we look at women and the challenges they face, would you say that these are vastly different to those that young people in business face?
Yeah, we know that there are many similarities and many overlaps between challenges that women and young people in business face. But in particular for young people in business, it's, you know, having access to that startup capital. And, you know, it's being able to have access to finance to start the business, run the business, as well as grow the business. Over and above that, some of the key challenges that young people in business face is, you know, the experience of having run a business and having the right networks in order to access the right markets. So it's one thing, you know, being able to register a business. It's another to put a product in front of paying customers. And that's really what some of the solutions within Absa we look at are, such as Absa SME Fridays. It's about creating access to networks and access to markets for young people and women in business.
Let's talk about some of these specific interventions that you as Absa have been working on. You've brought on a couple of partners, including the African Development Bank and the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management. Tell us about these partnerships and what you're hoping they will do for female-run businesses and youth SMEs.
Yes, sure. So last year we launched two solutions, Absa She Thrive and Absa Emerging Entrepreneur, which are both targeting women and youth in business respectively. Embedded in both of these solutions were both banking and beyond banking solutions. So when we look at the banking side, it's about having access to payments, access to finance, and access to a transactional account with transparent pricing. At the end of the day, as a business owner, you want to have that level of certainty of what you're paying for and what you're getting. Over and above that, we recognize the importance of skills development and real access to networks for our clients. And we do that through partnerships such as the one that you've noted now. Our partnership with the African Development Bank and the Frankfurt School of Finance and Management is really about putting power in the hands of our business owners. And we've developed these comprehensive programs looking at three things. The first is a funding readiness webinar series, which runs on the last Thursday of every month, with the first one having been launched last month in August. And the importance of the series is to say, prior to you accessing funding, it's important to make sure that your business is ready for that. And what does it mean for a business owner to get funding ready? And that funding readiness webinar series seeks to address that. The second is to say, from an access to networks point of view, how do we put together a program that goes beyond strategy, beyond the boardroom, beyond the classroom, and put real practical skills in the hands of our clients. And then the last piece is really around ongoing coaching and mentorship, because it's one thing to learn skills in a closed classroom. It's another to, apply those as you're running your business. And that's what this partnership seeks to achieve, because it's about building a holistic solution at the end of the day.
These are really exciting webinars because often, again, when it comes to entrepreneurs, is that there is so much paperwork that is involved in the process of applying for funding, whether you're applying to a state-owned development FDIs or whether it's to banks like Absa. Where do you find that often people go wrong in the process? Because again, some businesses fail not because the ideas are bad ideas, but that there just isn't that support to help them, get to the next phase.
Yeah, that's a great question. For many businesses, accessing funding is an important lever, both in being able to start or grow your business. And now, if you put yourself in the shoes of a business owner that's wearing multiple hats, so your CEO, your head of HR, your head of finance, you're also, actually running the factory floor, for instance, there are a lot of things to be considering at any given point in time. Part of what makes Absa stand out in this instance is the fact that the majority of our clients within the SME space are pre-scored, right? So if you have a transactional business bank account with us, filling in those application forms, which is quite admin intensive, is then no longer a requirement. And so it's also about being able to answer what are those pre-funding questions. So as a business owner, having clarity on how much funding you need, what you need the funding for. Can the business afford to repay any kind of funding? And also, will the funding give you access to new markets and therefore growth? So those are important questions to ask yourself prior to even starting the application process. And it's important to also consider, part of getting funding ready is separating the personal and business finances. And this is often more difficult, particularly for businesses that are starting out. But building that track record as early as possible is what enables that access.
Yeah, you make such a good point about the separation between the personal and the business finances. As you've said, you have these individuals that are literally a one-stop shop, right? So, of course, even when it comes to the finances, there is that conflation there. Let's talk about your She's Next program that you're running in collaboration with Visa.
Yes, so She's Next is an incredible program that we've partnered with Visa on. It is a global initiative designed to support and empower women in business. specifically by providing them with resources, tools, and funding opportunities. As Absa, we are the first partner in Sub-Saharan Africa to launch this program with Visa, and it's seeking to address pure developmental challenges that women in business face. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's everything from running a business, starting a business, and scaling that business. And this program with Visa, She's Next, is the objective is to address each of those key requirements through a targeted development program.
I imagine that the question on the mind of those that are listening is, how can they participate? How can they get involved and sign up for these programs?
Yes, of course. So in particular, all the information related to Absa She Thrives and Emerging Entrepreneur is available on our website, and we've got a dedicated line for entrepreneurs that they can ask any questions on. But also on our socials, we've got these programs that are running, such as the Funding Readiness webinar series that I've made mention of, which is open to all, by the way, whether you're a business starting out, whether you've just got an idea, or you've been in business for a long time. The idea and the objective is for it to be democratic in nature. We don't want to make it seem that it's only to very specific businesses, and that's quite important, because just because a business has been operating for a number of years doesn't mean that they don't need a similar level of support from a funding point of view. So all this information is available on our social media platforms as well as our website.
Kanya Matikwe, let me thank you so much for your time and for this conversation. She is the head of client at Absa. And of course, this conversation has been brought to you by Absa Business Banking. Your story matters, Absa. Well, that brings us to the end of the talking point for today. We will be back with you again tomorrow between 9 and midday. Have yourselves a lovely afternoon. And of course, stay tuned to SFM for all your latest news and current affairs updates. And of course, lots of talk that keeps you in good company. Do enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Only the final whistle can reveal who are the